Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the History Desk. I'm Jonathan. In this week's episode, we're going to follow up on something we discussed last week in the French and Indian War topic, and that is Rogers Rangers. As a refresher, they were used to expel Acadians from Canada by the British when they took the area during the French and Indian War. But they also did other things during the war and fought in a few battles. In this episode, we will discuss the history of the unit, both in the French and Indian War and the American War of Independence, Rogers' leaving of the unit and forming another, the change of command from Rogers to John Graves Simcoe, and we'll also discuss Simcoe himself because he is such an interesting person in the history of North America. So let's begin. Rogers Rangers began in 1755 as a company of rangers attached that were pulled out of the provisional forces of the colony of New Hampshire in British North America. It was the latest in a long line of New England Ranger companies dating back to 1670s. Most important of those being Gorham's Rangers, was formed in 1744. Both Gorham's Rangers and the Rogers Rangers would be in the field at the same time, and they would accompany each other on many missions as they would go into the field. They were commanded by Captain and later Major Robert Rogers and operated primarily out of Lake George and Lake Champlain regions of New York. The unit was formed during the winter of 1755 from forces stationed at Fort William Henry. They sometimes undertook raids against French towns and military emplacements, traveling on foot, whaleboats, and even snowshoes during the winter. And a very important person that would later be in the Revolutionary War, Israel Putnam, fought with Robert Rangers during the French and Indian War. The usefulness of Robert's Rangers was seen in 1756 and 1757, prompted the British to form a second Ranger Company, which would soon follow by more. By early 1758, the Rangers had been expanded to a corps of 14 companies, composed of between 1,200 and 1,400 men, that included 3 all-Indian units, 2 Stockbridge Mackans, and 1 Indian unit from Connecticut, mainly Mohegan and Pequot. Rogers was then promoted to Major and served as commander of the whole Ranger Corps. Let's talk about the battles that they fought in during the French and Indian War. The first battle on snowshoes was on January 21st, 1757. Rogers led 74 of his Rangers to ambush the French, capturing 7 prisoners near Fort Carillon, which, of course, once the British took it, would be Fort Ticonderoga, as it's known now, the south end of Lake Champlain. They were attacked by about 100 French and Canadian militia and their Ottawa allies from the Ohio country. Rogers' men suffered casualties and retreated without further losses, since the French lacked snowshoes and were floundering in the snows, as Rogers is known to say. They maintained their positions on the high ground behind long trees. According to Francis Parkman, Ranger casualties were 14 killed, 6 captured, and 6 wounded, the wounded returning with 48 men who were unharmed. The French consisted of 89 regulars and 90 Canadians and Indians. They had 37 killed and wounded. The French and Indian casualties may have included one of their captured prisoners. One wounded and captured Ranger, who was later exchanged, claimed to have killed one of the captured Frenchmen by striking him in the head with a tomahawk after the Rangers were ambushed, but it's unclear if the fate of the captured Frenchman. A company of the Rangers led by Noah Johnson was stationed at Fort William Henry in 1757 during the siege. The siege ended with the surrender and massacre of the British forces by the Indians, as we discussed last week. And after this, the Rangers were stationed on Rogers Island near Fort Edward. This allowed them to train and operate with more freedom than a regular force. The second battle on snowshoes was fought on March 13, 1758. Rogers Rangers ambushed a French and Indian column and were ambushed in turn by enemy forces. The Rangers lost 125 men in this encounter, as well as 8 men wounded, with 52 surviving. Some references report casualties of the regulars who had volunteered to accompany the Rangers as 2 captured and 5 killed. Of Robert's Rangers, 78 were captured and 47 killed and missing, of whom 19 were captured. Rogers estimated 100 killed and nearly 100 wounded of the French and Indian forces. The French, however, reported Their casualties is just 10 Indians killed and 17 wounded, and 3 Canadians wounded. The French originally reported killing Rogers in the second battle. This was based on them finding some of his belongings, including his regimental coat containing his military commission. However, he had escaped, and this episode gave rise to the legend of Rogers sliding 400 feet down the side of a mountain to the frozen lake of St. George. But there is no proof this actually happened, but the rock face is still known as Rogers Slide or Rogers Rock. Next is the Siege of Louisburg. 4 companies of Rogers Rangers, about 500 Rangers, arrived on the provincial vessel King George and were at Dartmouth, Nova Scotia from April 8th to May 28th, awaiting the Siege of Louisburg in 1758. While they were there, they scoured the wood to stop raids on the capital. During the siege, the Rangers were the first to go ashore at freshwater cover and encountered 100 Micmac and French soldiers. James Wolfe and Scott followed up the Rangers. The Rangers killed and scalped the chief Micmac. In their retreat, the Rangers captured 70 defenders and killed more than 50. The next engagement was Carillon and Crown Point, or Fort Ticonderoga, as we know it today. On July 7th through the 8th of 1758, Rogers Rangers took part in the Battle of Carillon, or Fort Ticonderoga. And on July 27th, 1758, between Fort Edwards and Halfway Brook, 300 Indians and 200 French Canadians under Captain St. Luc ambushed a British convoy. The British lost 116 killed, including 16 Rangers and 60 captured. On August 8th, 1758, near Crown Point, New York, a British force of Rangers, light infantry, and provincials was ambushed by a French-Canadian force of 450 under Captain Marine. In this action, Major Israel Putnam, as we discussed will be very important to the American Revolution, was captured. He was reported saved from burning at the stake by the Indians, thought through the intervention of a French officer and a very timely thunderstorm. Francis Parkman reported 49 British fatalities and more than 100 killed of the enemy. Rogers claimed the British losses were 33 and those enemy of 199. Other sources place those casualties being much lower. Commanders usually will overestimate their casualties to make their forces look better, but some reports say that there were only 4 Indians and 6 Canadians killed and 4 Indians and 6 Canadians wounded, including maybe an officer and a cadet. The raid at St. Francis during 1759, the Rangers were involved in one of the most famous operations, St. Francis raid. They had been ordered to destroy the Abenaki settlement of St. Francis in Quebec. It was the base of the raids and attacks on British settlements, so they wanted to stop those. Rogers led a force of 200 Rangers from Crown Point, deep in the French territory. Following October 13, 1759 attack and successful destruction of St. Francis, Rogers' force ran out of food on their retreat through the wilderness of northern England. They reached a safe location along the Connecticut River at the abandoned Fort Wentworth, where Rogers left his men. He returned a few days later with food and relief from Fort in Charleston, New Hampshire, the nearest British outpost. In the raid at St. Francis, Rogers claimed 200 enemies had been killed, leaving 20 women and children to be taken prisoner. He took 5 children as captives and released the rest. The French recorded 30 deaths, including 20 women and children. According to Francis Parkman, Ranger casualties in the attack were 1 killed and 6 wounded. In the retreat, 5 were captured from one band of Rangers, and nearly all in another party of about 20 Rangers was killed or captured. One source alleges that only about 100 returned of the 240 Rangers, allies, and observers. As you can see, very disparaging reports on both sides of casualties. The raid on St. Therese. In spring of 1760, the Rangers joined Amherst's campaign on Montreal, but before doing so, conducted a successful preemptive raid on Fort Sainte Therese, which was used to supply the French army, as well as being a vital link to the communication supply line between Saint Fort Jean and French forces. The settlement and fort were burned by Rogers, following which French and Indian ambushers were repelled between their return to Crown Point with minor losses. Rogers' Rangers took part in William Haviland's force, who marched from Lake Ontario in the west along St. Lawrence River from upper New York via the Richelieu River in August. Along the way, Rangers fought to reduce the fortified French island of l'Île Noire. During the bombardment of the island, Haviland sent Rogers' four ranger companies, as well as light infantry and a force of Indians to drag 3 cannon through the forest and swamps further down near the French position. With much difficulty, this was achieved, and in a few days the guns were planted on the riverbank where French naval forces stood defending it. Rogers' cannon opened up upon these vessels, surprised them. The closest sloop cut their cable, and a strong west wind then drove her ashore into the hands of the British. The other vessels and gunboats made all sail downstream, but stranded in a bend of the river, where the Rangers, swimming out with their tomahawks, boarded and took one of them, and the rest soon surrendered. With their communications cut, and the French evacuated the island, which then fell to the British. Soon after, the Fort St. John and Chambly were burned by the French. The Rangers then led a final advance on Montreal, which surrendered without a fight the following month. And that would end their involvement in the French and Indian War. Because later on, soon after that, with the fall of Montreal, the French and Indian War would end. After the war, at the end of the war, the Rangers were given a task of taking command of Fort Detroit from French forces, and after the war, most of the Rangers returned to civilian life. In 1763, Rogers recruited several volunteers for the reinforcement of Detroit, commanded by James Delisle of the 1st Royal Regiment and formerly of the 80th Regiment of Light Armed Foot. Upon arrival at Detroit, Delisle took command of Henry Galvin into allowing Delisle to take his reinforcements to attack an Indian village near Parents Creek. The force of 250 to 300 soldiers of the 55th and 60th Regiments, Rogers Volunteers, and Queen's Royal American Rangers under the command of Joseph Hopkins were ambushed as the advance guard made up men of the 55th Regiment crossed the bridge at Parents Creek. Rogers Volunteers were responsible for effectively covering the retreat, and the force was able to make it back to Fort Detroit. When the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, Robert Rogers offered his services to George Washington. However, Washington turned him down, fearing that he might have been a spy because he had just come from a long stay in England. And this made Rogers extremely infuriated, and he offered his services to the British, who accepted. And in 1776, he formed the Queen's Rangers. And this brings us to Robert Rogers' Rangers in the American Revolution, now known as the Queen's Rangers. When the war broke out in 1775, about 50 Loyalist regiments were raised, including Butler's Rangers, the King's Royal Regiment, and the Maryland and Pennsylvania Loyalists. Robert Rogers was again asked to raise a unit, this time in New York, mostly from Loyalists living in Westchester and Long Island, from Western Connecticut, and the men from the Queen's Laurel Virginia Regiment. The new unit was named in honor of Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III. It first assembled on Staten Island in August of 1776 and grew to 937 officers and men, organized into 11 companies and about 30 men each, and an additional 5 troops of cavalry. The unit immediately set about building fortresses and redoubts, including one that stood at Lookout Place. Rogers did not prove successful in this command, and he left on January 29th in 1777. The regiment had suffered serious casualties at the Battle of Manomanek, a surprise attack on the outpost position New York on October 22nd of 1776. 11 months later, on September 11th, 1777, they did distinguish themselves at the Battle of Brandywine, suffering many casualties while attacking entrenched American positions. They were then commanded by Major James Wemyss. On October 15th, 1777, John Graves Simcoe was given command when the unit became known as Simcoe's Rangers. So now we went from Robert Rogers' Rangers to the Queen's Rangers, and now Simcoe's Rangers. Simcoe would turn the Rangers into one of the most successful British regiments of the war. They provided escort and patrol duty around Philadelphia from 1777 to 78, fought in the Philadelphia campaign, served as rear guard during the British retreat from New York in 1778, fought the Stockbridge militia in the Bronx in 1778, fought on October 26, 1779 in New Jersey, where Simcoe was captured but freed in a prisoner exchange on December 31st, 1779 at Charleston. In the Richmond raid with Benedict Arnold, and in other raids in Virginia from 1780 to 1781. The unit would surrender at Yorktown, and its rank and file were in prison at Winchester, Virginia. Earlier, on May 2nd, 1779, the regiment was taken into establishment as the 1st American Regiment and was later, on December 25th, 1782, taken into the establishment in the British military. So now it's no longer a provincial group, it's part of the whole British military. In 1783, when the war ended by the Treaty of Paris, the Queen's Rangers left New York for Nova Scotia, where it was disbanded. Many of them formed Queensbury, New Brunswick on land grants. So they left the unit, got land grants for their service, and they formed the town of Queensbury, New Brunswick. After the war, American independence in 1791, when Simcoe was named Lieutenant Governor of the newly created Upper Canada, the Queen's Rangers were revived to form one of the core defense forces. The leaders were mostly veterans of the American War of Independence. Although there was little military action during this period, the Rangers were instrumental in building Upper Canada through Simcoe's various plans and when he was the governor. They did things like blaze trails for roads. They set up forts. They also built the original Fort York, where they were stationed, and the Queen Rangers were disbanded in 1802, with most of the men joining the York Militia, which is now Toronto. During the War of 1812, many of the disbanded Rangers would come back to service, but in the Upper Canada Militia. During the rebellions of 1837, Samuel Peter Jarvis ranged a new Queen's Rangers out of the York Militia to fight the rebels, which again disbanded soon after being raised. So really, the end of the Rangers is 1837, officially, but there are modern-day units that believe that they are descended from the Rangers. A Canadian Army Reserve unit called the Queen's York Rangers, the first American unit, traces its roots to the original Roberts Rangers. There's also the U.S. Army Rangers, who trace their units to the Rangers as well. Robert Rogers, when he formed the Rangers, made up a list of rules of ranging. It was Rogers' Rules of Ranging, and there were 18 of them. And they are implemented into the U.S. Army Rangers today, but in a modern sense. So you have these modern-day units that now pay homage to the original Roberts Rangers. So we get to see Simcoe. He takes command and makes the unit a very first-class unit. So who was John Graves Simcoe? Most people know Simcoe as his portrayal on Turn Washington Spies, as a villain, as a bad guy, as a very ruthless man, where he was not. He was actually a very smart man. He was a very good man. So we're going to talk a little bit about John Graves Simcoe because he's very important in North American history, especially Canadian history. But he serves in many of the major events in North American history. So we'll skip his early life. We'll get to his military career, and then we'll go from there, and we'll see how his life just weaves its way through American history, North American history, and even beyond. In 1770, Simcoe entered the British Army as an ensign in the 35th Regiment of Foot, and his unit was dispatched to the 13 colonies. Later, he saw action in the Revolutionary War, of course, during the Siege of Boston. After the siege, in July of 1776, he was promoted captain in the 40th Regiment of Foot. He saw action with the Grenadier Company of the 40th Foot in New York and New Jersey campaigns and the Philadelphia campaign. Simcoe commanded the 40th Grenadiers at the Battle of Brandywine, which, as we know from earlier, Robert's Rangers were there, on 11 September 1777, where he was wounded. And there are some legends that say that he ordered his men at Brandywine not to fire at 3 fleeing rebels, and one of those rebels was George Washington. In 1777, Simcoe sought to form a loyalist regiment of free blacks, and this will be very important later. He saw African Americans as a different way than people of those times from Boston, but instead was offered the command of the Queen Rangers and Staten Island in October 15th, 1777, and that's what he took. It was a well-trained light infantry unit comprising of 11 companies of 30 men, 1 grenadier, 1 hussar, and the rest light infantry. And as we know, the Queen's Rangers saw extensive action during the Philadelphia Command, including the successful surprise attack at the Battle of Crooked Billet. In 1778, Simcoe led the attack on Judge William Hancock's house during the foraging expedition opposed by Patriot militia. The attack killed 10 militiamen in their sleep and wounded 5 others. William Hancock was also killed, although he was not with the Americans. The attack took place at night with bayonets. On 28 June of that year, Simcoe and his Queen's Rangers took part in the Battle of Monmouth in the near Freehold, New Jersey. On 31st August 1778, Lieutenant Colonel Simcoe led a massacre of 40 Native Americans allied with the Continental Army in what is today the Bronx, New York. And that would be when he took up the uprising and the militia in Bronx, a place known as Indian Field in Van Coldet Park in Bronx, New York. So he wasn't perfect. On October 26, 1779, Simcoe and 80 men launched an attack on central New Jersey from southern Staten Island, known as Simcoe's Raid. For what is known today as the Conference House, resulted in the burning of Patriot supplies, including a Dutch Reformed church in Findon, which included hay and grain, the release of Loyalist prisoners from the Somerset County Courthouse, and Simcoe's capture at this raid as well. As we said earlier, he was captured. Simcoe was released at the end of 1779 and rejoined his unit in Virginia. He participated in the raid on Richmond with Benedict Arnold in July of 1781 and was involved in a skirmish near Williamsburg and was at the siege of Yorktown. He was invalided back to England in December of that year as lieutenant colonel, having been promoted on March of 1782. So he had to go back and rest up from the wounds that he had accrued during the war. He also wrote a book of his time in the Queen's Rangers. It is titled A Journey of the Operations of the Queen Rangers from the end of the year 1777 to the conclusion of the late American War. He was briefly Inspector General of Recruitment for British Army in 1789 until his departure for Upper Canada 2 years later. Marriage and family. When he was convalesced back in England at the Devon home of his godfather and Admiral Samuel Graves, in 1782, Simcoe married Elizabeth Posthuma Gwilman, which is godfather's ward. She was a wealthy heiress who acquired 5,000-acre estate in Honiton in Devon and built Woodford Lodge. Woodford was the Simcoe family seat until 1923. The Simcoes had 5 daughters before their posting in Canada. Son Francis was born in 1791. Their Canadian-born daughter, Catherine, died in infancy in York, which is present-day Toronto. She is buried in Victoria Square Memorial Park on Portland Avenue, Toronto. Francis returned with his father to England when his tenure expired and joined the army. He was killed in the infantry charge during the Peninsular War, Napoleonic Wars in 1812. Son Henry Addington Simcoe became an English theologian. He had a brief stint in politics, where he was a member of Parliament at St. Mawes in Cornwall. As a member of Parliament, he proposed raising a militia force like the Queen's Rangers. He also preferred to lead an invasion of Spain, but instead was to be made Lieutenant Governor of the new Loyalist province of Upper Canada. He resigned from Parliament in 1792 to take up this new post. So this is the most important part of his life here. When he's a Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, he's going to do so much for this region. It's still seen today in Upper Canada. The Constitutional Act of 1791 divided Canada into two provinces, Upper Canada, which is Ontario, and Lower Canada around the Quebec area. The Act established separate governments and legislative assemblies for each province. Lower Canada was French-speaking eastern portion, which retained the French civil law and protections of the Roman Catholic Church, established when Britain took over the area after its defeat of the French in the 7 Years' War. So, in our topic last week, we discussed that part of the agreement in the Treaty of Paris was they had to allow the Roman Catholics to stay Roman Catholic in that part. So this became its own separate section of Canada. Upper Canada was the western area, newly settled after the American Revolutionary War. These settlers were mostly English speakers, including Loyalists from the 13 colonies and also the Six Nation of Iroquois, who had been British allies during the war. The Crown had purchased the land from the Mississauga, and other First Nations to give the Loyalists land grants and partial compensation for property lost in the United States and to help set them up new communities and develop the territories. Purchased this land from the Indians. Everybody lost when the Revolutionary War was lost for the British. And many people moved. They lost land grants, they lost homes, they lost land, so they needed new land, and this is where the British settled them. Simcoe was appointed lieutenant governor on 12 September 1791 and left for Canada with his wife Elizabeth and daughter Sophia, leaving 3 daughters behind in England with their aunt. They left England in September and arrived in Canada on 11 November. Due to severe weather, the Simcoe spent the winter in Quebec City, and Simcoe finally reached Kingston, Upper Canada on the 24th of June 1792. In a proclamation on 16 July 1792, he renamed several islands at the mouth of the archipelago at the head of St. Lawrence River to commemorate British generals of the 7 Years' War: Amherst Island, Carleton Island, Gage Island, Wolfe Island, and Howe Island. Under the Constitutional Act, the provincial government consisted of lieutenant governor, an appointed executive council and legislative council, and an elected legislative assembly. The first meeting of the 9-member legislative council and 16-member legislative assembly took place at Newark on September 17, 1792. Now it's Niagara-on-the-Lake. Here we're going to see Simcoe's differences of opinions on his black citizens that you saw during the Revolutionary War when his want to build up a all-black militia at the time. There was an incident known as the Chloe Cooley incident. She was a young black woman held as a slave in Fort Erie and Queenston, Upper Canada, in the late 1700s. As the area had been settled by loyalists from the United States who owned slaves, her owner forced her into a boat to sell her across the Niagara River in the United States in 1793. Because of this, the Assembly passed the Act Against Slavery in 1793, the first legislation to limit slavery in the British Empire. The English colonists of Upper Canada took pride in its distinction with respect to French-Canadian populace of Lower Canada. The Upper Canadians valued their common law legal system, as opposed to the civil law of Quebec, which had chafed them ever since 1763. This was one of the primary reasons for the partition in 1791. Simcoe collaborated extensively with his Attorney General John White on the file. And we have a quote from John Graves Simcoe: "The principles of the British Constitution do not admit that slavery with Christianity condemns. The moment I assume the government of Upper Canada, under no modification will I assent to law that discriminates by honesty policy between natives of Africa, America, or Europe." He was a very proponent of abolition of slavery, and he would free the slaves in Upper Canada before anyone else would. Slavery was thus ended in Upper Canada long before it was abolished in British Empire as a whole. By 1810, there were no slaves in Upper Canada, but the Crown did not abolish slavery in the entire empire until 1834. Simcoe's first priority was the Northeast Indian War between the United States and the Western Confederacy of Native Americans, west of the Appalachian Mountains and south of the Great Lakes. These would be the Shawnee, the Miami, and Wyandotte, and other tribes. This conflict began around 1785 and was still raging when Simcoe arrived in 1792. Simcoe had the idea to form an Indian buffer between the two countries, even though he distrusted Joseph Brant, the main Indian leader. Simcoe rejected the section of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which awarded the area to the United States, on the grounds that America Ashton had nullified the treaty. However, the French Revolutionary Wars broke out in 1793. The government in London decided to seek good terms with the United States. Simcoe was instructed to avoid giving the U.S. reason to mistrust Britain, but at the same time to keep natives on both sides of the border friendly to Britain. The Indians asked for British military support, which was initially refused, but in 1794, Britain supplied the Indians with rifles and ammunition. In February 1794, the Governor-General, Lord Dorchester, expected the U.S. to ally with France, said that the war was likely to break out between U.S. and Britain before the year was out. This encouraged the Indians in their war. Dorchester ordered Simcoe to rally the Indians and arm British vessels on the Great Lakes. He also built Fort Miami, present-day Maumee, Ohio, to supply the Indians. Simcoe expelled Americans from a settlement on the southern shore of Lake Erie, which had threatened British control of the lake. U.S. President Washington denounced the irregular and high-handed proceeding of Mr. Simcoe. While Dorchester planned for a defensive war, Simcoe urged London to declare war and said that Upper Canada could not be defended by remaining within the border line. Dorchester was officially reprimanded by the Crown for his strong speech against the Americans in 1794. Simcoe realized that Newark made an unsuitable capital because it was on the Canadian-U.S. border and subject to attack. He proposed moving the capital to a more defensive position in the middle of Upper Canada's southwestern peninsula between Lake Erie and Lake Huron. He named the new location London and renamed the river there the Thames in anticipation of the change. Dorchester rejected his proposal but accepted Simcoe's second choice, the present site of Toronto. Simcoe moved the capital there in 1793 and renamed the settlement York after Frederick, Duke of York, King George III's second son. The town was severely underdeveloped at the time of its founding, so Simcoe brought with him politicians, builders, Nova Scotia timbermen, and Englishmen skilled in whipsawing and cutting joists for rafters. Simcoe began construction of 2 roads through Upper Canada for defense and to encourage settlement and trade. Yonge Street, named for Britisher of War Sir George Yonge, ran north and south from Lake Simcoe. Soldiers of the Queen's Rangers, his old unit, began cutting the road in August of 1793, reaching Holland Landing in 1796, and Dundas Street, named for Colonial Secretary Henry Dundas, ran east-west between York and London. The Northwest Indian War ended after the United States defeated the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. They made peace under the Treaty of Greenville. While still at war with France, Britain could not afford to antagonize the U.S. in the Jay Treaty of 1794 and agreed to withdraw north of the Great Lakes, as agreed in the Treaty of Paris. Simcoe evacuated his frontier forts and moved all of his forces back to Upper Canada. In 1794, Simcoe was appointed to the rank of Major General, but in July of 1796, poor health from gout and other injuries caused by his time in the military forced him to return to Britain. He was unable to return to Upper Canada and resigned his office in 1798. From October of 1796 until March of 1797, Simcoe briefly served as commander of the British Expeditionary Force, which was dispatched to capture the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, which was in the midst of a slave rebellion, which is actually the only successful slave rebellion in history. After assuming control of the British forces in Saint-Domingue, Simcoe was attacked by Haitian forces under the command of Toussaint Louverture, who, as at the time, was fighting on behalf of the French Republic. He would later switch sides and fight on the Haitian slave population. An assault on the British-held town of St. Mark was repulsed, though Haitian forces captured Maribelis and the Central Patro. Simcoe was eventually replaced as the leader of the Expeditionary Force in March. Simcoe was appointed colonel of the 81st Foot in 1798, but exchanged his position for the 22nd Foot less than 6 months later. He was also promoted to lieutenant general and was made commander of the Western District. In 1806, he was appointed commander-in-chief of India to succeed Lord Cornwallis from the American Revolutionary War. which we will talk about soon, who died shortly after arriving in India when he was given the post. Simcoe died in Exeter before assuming his post. Gerald Lake, first Viscount, was to replace him as the head of India. Simcoe is buried in Woolfle Chapel on the Simcoe family estate near Huntington, Devon, and the Ontario Heritage Foundation acquired the title to the chapel in 1982. Many of Simcoe's personal effects, including his sword, saber, and walking cane, are viewable at the Archives of Ontario in Toronto, which I suggest to everyone visits if they ever get the chance, because it's a beautiful place. And Elizabeth Simcoe's personal effects and hundreds of her watercolor paintings are also available there. As you can see, Simcoe is very important to North American history. Not only did he fight in the American Revolution on the side of the British, his stance on slavery in Canada was before its time in the rest of the British Empire. And he did many great things for Upper Canada, and then Canada as a whole, with the building of roads for military defense and the moving of the population. And this is something that was not, these large expeditions were not seen at the time. In 1903, there's an unveiling of General John Graves Simcoe Monument at Queen Park in Toronto. It's a beautiful monument. It was Walter Seaman Allard that made it. It's a very pretty monument. If you're ever in Ontario, I suggest you go see it. A few things also about Simcoe. He is the first known sender of a Valentine's Day letter in America when he was a lieutenant colonel, to Sarah Sally Townsend, who may or may not have been a spy. For her brother Townsend was a spy, but she may have not been. There are many things named after him. Of course, he's very important. He's Simcoe Streets. There's a town Simcoe in Canada. Simcoe Island, Simcoe Hall. He's a very important figure in Canada. So, look at the back on this episode. Queen's Rangers, start off at Roberts Rangers, set a standard for provincial forces during the French and Indian War and the American War of Independence. Many important persons, they led many important people to power. Robert Rogers does eventually form another unit when he leaves the Rangers. He forms another unit and they stay in Upper Canada, and that's where the Rangers are actually recalled in War of 1812, and they train there on Rogers Island because he's given a large tract of land after the American Revolution. But Simcoe's rise to power, if you want to call it that, in Canada probably would not have been as large if it had not been for Robert's Rangers and his taking control of the Queen's Rangers when he did, and his excellent use of them in battle. He was not a perfect man, but he was not the evil man portrayed in the Turn Washington Spies series. He was a very adamant abolitionist, as we could see his wanting to build a unit of freed blacks militia during the Revolutionary War, and his immediate freedom of all the slaves in Upper Canada. He would not tolerate slavery. It was something he did not like at all. I want to thank you for listening today. I hope you enjoyed learning about Roberts Rangers and John Graves Simcoe. I do suggest, if you can find a copy of John Graves Simcoe's book, it is a valuable read. Not as easy to find as it once was. You may be able to find it online somewhere, but I suggest Googling him, you'll be able to find it. Until next time, enjoy for listening. Never stop reading. Remember to check us out on Facebook at the History Desk, where we will continue conversations and maps, books, suggestions. Continue the conversations there. If you would like to support the channel and the podcast, we have a Patreon. It is linked in our show notes, and any donations, any monies given to the channel will go to making the channel better for its listeners, and with better equipment and better audio editing softwares. And with that being said, we thank you for listening. We hope to see you next time, and goodbye.